and then start share. All right, so you should see Art and Philosophy, Nude and the Other.
That's the one.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming to this rescheduled class of Art and Philosophy about the nude and the other. And this is recorded for those who could not make it, and we're sending the link. So basically what I'm doing is a very fast and very compressed history of feminism and race theory. I just wanted to situate that along a timeline of post-World War II philosophical developments. So you're looking here, you've got to start at 1953. That's when Simone de Beauvoir publishes her groundbreaking work, The Second Sex. So just after the war, then we've got the Second World War, then the Vietnam War begins. You get the Berlin Wall. Other important things that are happening in terms of race and gender is the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But I also added Sontag's Against Interpretation, which we talked about in the first class. You can see is happening about that same time in the 1960s. Then in the late 60s, you have deconstructive thought and all of those French post-structuralists coming into the picture. Then that goes all the way through into the late 70s with Lyotard and the idea of the postmodern condition. So we have that sort of modernity is said to have ended sometime in the late 70s, and everything that happens after that is considered postmodern. And in that time of the postmodern condition coming into philosophical thought through the French, this is when Edward Said publishes his groundbreaking work on post-colonial theory called Orientalism. So postmodernism is happening at about the same time as post-colonialism. Then in the 80s, we have the work of the Guerrilla Girls, which we'll be talking about at the end of this class. And that's when you have what we might call then the post-feminist theorists like Luce Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, and Bell Hooks. And then we come into the 90s, the World Wide Web and the War on Terror. And then I guess you could say that the era is then defined in the first decade, after the first decade of the 21st century, with Obama becoming the first African-American president of the USA. So, I just wanted to contextualize what we're talking about today within that broader sweep of post-war world history. Obviously, this is a USA-focused book that I got this out of, but obviously lots of different and other things happening in Australia and Europe and Africa and other places like that. But this is what we're talking about today and the context in which we're talking about it. So I guess I'm calling this Philosophy and the Other, and why I'm calling it Philosophy and the Other will become apparent as I go through the various philosophers. So let's start with where feminism was basically born. Where does it actually start? With the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 1700s. So before Wollstonecraft writes The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, previous thinkers or previous philosophers had said that it was basically the physical differences between the sexes that justified social inequality between men and women. Now, I'm just going to give you an ancient Greek philosopher. I'm not going to go through every male philosopher that claimed that, because we would need 10 classes to do that. But basically, Aristotle claimed that full humanity was equated with maleness, and female is only female by virtue of the fact that she lacks certain qualities. And pretty much every philosopher after that just followed on with Aristotle's claim, the idea of the lack. But then at the end of the 17th century, John Locke comes along and says, well, actually, if we understand all knowledge to come from education and experience, this started to call that particular reasoning of physical difference into question. And so then Wollstonecraft, based on John Locke's idea that knowledge is acquired through education and experience and not anything to do with physical characteristics, she argued that if men and women are given the same educational opportunities, then they can have the same rational approach to life. And she actually wrote Vindication in response to a book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau called Emile, that recommended that girls and boys be educated differently so that they learn deference. So Wollstonecraft's work was met with derision at the time, but it laid the foundations for the suffragette and feminist movements. So you can see here that there's a understanding, even on the part of non-feminists, that, yes, if you educate men and women, girls and boys in the same way, then girls will be, in inverted commas, as smart as boys. So let's educate girls in a way that teaches them deference to men and convinces them of their inferiority. And that way we can keep, the patriarchy alive, basically. So this is Locke. This is Locke saying that, rationalists believe that we're born with ideas and concepts that are innate, but he believes that that can't be true. You don't have innate ideas and concepts which are which are connected to you being born with female body parts as opposed to male body parts. But he wasn't thinking about it that way. That's what Wollstonecraft kind of picked up and reinterpreted. Because he says there's no truths that are found in everyone at birth, and there's no universal ideas found in people of all cultures at all times. And so he comes to the conclusion that everything we know is gained from experience. And by experience, that also means the experience of how you are educated and to what level you are educated affects everything you know. So Simone de Beauvoir is, I guess, the 20th century writer who really starts to put this down in thought. Her work, we could kind of describe it as existential feminism. And so it is born out of Heidegger's philosophy of existence, which we talked about in the first class. And then Sartre builds on Heidegger and says that existence precedes essence. So, she says, okay, if we're born without purpose, we've got to carve out our own authentic existence by choosing what we become. There's a whole idea about having control over your destiny. And so she applies this to the notion of woman by separating the biological entity, that is the bodily form of those who are assigned female at birth, from femininity, which she says is a social construct. Because constructs are open to change and interpretation, there's many ways in which you can be a woman, and that is an existential choice that you can make as a woman. And so then I just thought I'd bring back those three images of, representations of femininity that we talked about in the other classes. That is the femininity that Andy Warhol is evoking through this self-portrait in drag, is a social construct. As is Man Ray becoming another character, which is Eros c'est la vie, is also a social construct of femininity. But then again, Sydney Sherman, who is a woman herself biologically, is also making comments about social constructs of femininity. So they are all different kind. Andy Warhol is a man dressed as a woman. So he's saying biologically I'm a man, but I am representing a social construct of femininity. Marcel Duchamp is, yes, I'm a man, but I am taking on a persona, which is a social construct of femininity, and then looking visually like a woman. And then Cindy Sherman is going, yes, I am biologically a woman, making comments about the social construct of femininity. So I hope those kind of three artworks in comparison can show what de Beauvoir meant. So that's what she said. I mean, her most famous quote is, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." And she says that, most of those people who write about human nature have been men. And these men take maleness as a standard against which to judge it. And therefore, men have defined women by how they differ from this standard. So that's basically what Aristotle was saying. So that's why the idea is that man is defined as human being and woman as female. And that's where the other comes into play. Now, Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, said basically exactly the same thing. So, Room of One's Own, technically, you could think, okay, well, it's an essay about women in fiction, but actually it's a philosophical reflection on women and otherness and the importance of equal access to education for women's rights. So that's de Beauvoir. So she lays this kind of groundwork, and she has what we might call a binary system that she works on, which is male versus female, man versus woman, right? So she's got quite binary way of looking at things. So Luce Irigaray is another French philosopher who kind of picks up what de Beauvoir says about basically men's speech, men's values, men's dreams and desires become the law that then women have to somehow follow. So she's actually concerned with also with the philosophical implications of sexual difference. She was a student of Lacan, who was a famous linguist and linguistic philosopher. And so she was interested, so she studied Lacan, who was exploring the linguistic structure of the unconscious. And she thought that, oh, okay, so language, let's think about things through language. All language is basically masculine. And the struggle to find an authentically female ways of speaking and desiring that are free from male centeredness. So she said, rather than looking at femininity as defined through male ways of speaking, let's have a look at ways of speaking and desiring that are actually female in and of themselves. So it's a kind of return to what is the inner structure of femininity as opposed to how it's created or constructed. Because she says, well, all rational thinking is underpinned by desire, but that's the idea of male desire. And she says, well, actually, when males and females have actually different relationships to desire. And so she then calls into the question that whole idea of the equation that male is rational and female is irrational. Building on Irigaray's work, we have the work of Julia Kristeva, who says, if feminism starts to look at only fighting the power principle of a male-dominated world, then feminism risks becoming too dogmatic and becoming almost like too male in itself. So she breaks down the binary difference between male and female that de Beauvoir sort of set up. And she says, for any movement to be successful, to achieve true emancipation, it's got to constantly question its relationship to power and establish social systems. And if necessary, renounce belief in its own identity. So the thing is that, many feminists have offered accounts of the self that are designed to accommodate wider ranges of difference. So she also builds on the work of Judith Butler, who says that personal identity is an illusion, and that the self is a kind of unstable thing, and that sexed or gendered identity is a corporeal style. So the thing is that what then is feminine or gendered has to do with how we imitate and repeat certain norms or enact certain norms, and they're demanded by our cultural context. So she's starting to say that it's not that men are some kind of paradigm and the women that are different to it, is that both men and women are subject to imitating, repeating, and enacting norms demanded by their cultural context. And so she starts to break down that binary and say, hey, actually, all human beings are subject to this idea that maleness is not a paradigm from which women are different. Women and men are subject to the similar kinds of things. So that's a way to kind of break down the concept of the other in terms of gender. In terms of race, and of course I say race in inverted commas here with big air quotes, is because race theory has been debunked or changed in certain ways, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I guess Said is the equivalent of de Beauvoir in laying down the idea of other. So or pointing out the concept of other. So Simone de Beauvoir says there's everything is defined by male and women are other. Then Said says everything in the world is defined by whiteness, and the Orient or the East is somehow other. So he comes up with this idea of Orientalism in 1978. So on the cusp of postmodernist movement, you have the idea of a post-colonial movement. And he says that Orientalism is basically a style, and it's used to dominate, restructure, and have authority over the Orient. Now, he gets his ideas, or he builds his ideas on those of Foucault, on the concept of discourse. And he used Foucault's ideas about discourse and power to assert that the West, via Orientalism, represents the East, and that means Middle East, China, Japan, and India, as exotic, mysterious, distant, and unknowable. And if you actually make the East exotic, distant, mysterious, distant, and unknowable, that's how you control it. And if you think about it, that's also how women were framed. Women are framed as exotic, mysterious, distant, unknowable, changeable creatures. We can't understand them. And therefore, that's how we use that idea to control them. But Said said there never was an Orient. The Orient was an invention that Westerners used to subjugate the Orient, right? So he's thinking, okay, if discourse is the way we talk and think about things, and that it's framed by a set of largely unconscious rules that arise from historical conditions, how can we use that idea of discourse and apply it to the Orient? So it's basically Orientalism is the way the West thinks and talks about the East, and it's framed by rules that arise from historical conditions. And those historical conditions are the conditions of colonialism and imperialism of mostly European nations over the rest of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you have a question, Diane? No. Okay. All right. So that's what Said says. It's basically a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. But people have come along after Said and said that this divide between East and West is a little bit too simplistic. And that colonial experience is more complicated and multifaceted, with more players and participants than the binary division allows. So as with Orientalism, so as with feminism, that later thinkers have come along, like Christopher and Irigaray, have said, okay, just breaking things down in male and female is too simplistic. There's a whole kind of swathe of identities in there. And this is even without getting into the gender politics of people who are assigned one gender at birth and who actually feel they are another gender. So all the trans stuff, which I'm not going to get into, but that is part of the spectrum of femininity and masculinity. So just as a binary definition between male and female doesn't really work for feminism, a binary definition between East and West doesn't really work for post-colonialism or Orientalism. But the thing is, and I say this, is that de Beauvoir and Said were the ones that had to set up the binary in the first place and call it out so that then it could be broken down, thought through more, and understood with as a spectrum that has a lot more nuance to it. So Said's framework has been applied to very many different colonial situations and relationships, because you think about the colonial condition in Australia is very different to the colonial condition in North Africa or in Tahiti or anywhere, because a lot of it has to do with what was the colonial project behind the colonialists. Were they there for trading? Were they there to convert people to Christianity? What were the colonialists doing there in the first place? Orientalism doesn't always fit the colonial condition, basically. But he did raise a set of theoretical issues, especially about representation and discourse about the East, that have been widely influential. So colonialism as a mechanism is one thing, but how the East or the conquered lands are represented and discussed by the West, that's really what is much more interesting. So basically, Orientalism is defined by Said as three interdependent things. It's an academic field. It's a style of thought that's based on both ontological and epistemological distinction between Orient and Occident. By ontological, I mean how ontology is the philosophy of being, and epistemological is the way in which we know the world. So Orientalism says the way that Oriental people are and the way that Oriental people know the world is different and distinct from how Occidental people are within themselves in their nature as human beings and how they know the world. He also says that Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient by dominating, restructuring, and having authority over it. And the Occident has authority over the Orient in 5 different ways. It makes statements about it. It authorizes views on it. It describes it. It teaches it, and it settles and rules over it. Did someone have a question there, or is it just a kind of assent? I know that's a lot to hit you with. Diane, did you have a question? No? All good? Okay. All right, so we've talked about gender and we talked about race. But what happens when race and gender come together? And this is where we have the work of Bell Hooks, or AKA Gloria Jean Watkins. So she looked at the concept of marginality. So if you're on the margins because you are not white, or you're on the margins because you are not male, right? Or if you are a Black woman like Bell Hooks, you're doubly on the margins, okay? She goes, well, what if we actually turn this marginality thing around? So rather than think about marginality as a space of oppression and deprivation, what if we looked at marginality as a site of transformation? What if we emphasized that there's a distinction between marginality, which is imposed by oppressive structures, and marginality that one can choose, firstly, as a site of resistance, and secondly, as a location of radical openness and possibility? And so that, as you see, goes back to Simone de Beauvoir's existential idea of how to be female. How about we choose the way in which we are female rather than be determined by the cultural norms to tell us how to be female? So Bell Hooks is saying, okay, how can we choose to be marginal? And then how can we use our marginality as a site of resistance? It's an interesting thought. So, Bell Hooks is an interdisciplinary scholar / philosopher, critic, you could call her. And she worked across many different disciplinary divides. So she critiqued educational theory and practice. She critiqued the theorization of racial constructions, the dynamics of gender. She also wrote about spirituality and love. And then she also said spirituality and love can be ways in which we can correct all of these differences in the postmodern context. So she's about challenging dominant paradigms of race, class, and gender, and she transgressed and disrupt codes that exclude others as intellectually mediocre, and finds a position in which to challenge hegemonic practices from the margins. So whereas the early feminists were just like, no, we need to break down the power structure, and then risk becoming as dogmatic as the patriarchy. She says, no, let's always begin from our position of marginality and use that as a form of power rather than as a form of oppression. So then these two ideas of inferiority and superiority, as connected to race and gender, become the framework for this other writer called Angela Saini. And she wrote two I absolutely thoroughly recommend these books, because a lot of this kind of history that I've given you, I was able to do because I read these two books by Angela Saini. But where she talks about race and gender from a scientific point of view. So she's a journalist, but she's not technically a philosopher, but she's reported on this kind of social, philosophical, economic basis for claiming that people of colour and women are inferior to white males. And what is the reason behind it and how science gets used to do so. So I thoroughly recommend these books because they're very easy to read, they're very readable, and she gives a really great history of how we sort of got to the point that we are today. So in the Inferior book, she examines research and looks at everything from whether little boys actually do prefer playing with cars rather than dolls, to whether the structure of the female brain is different from the male brain. And even whether it was inevitable that human beings would end up with a patriarchal society. I mean, people like Charles Darwin, thought that women were inferior because their brains were smaller. Like he says, if you're a smaller human being and you have a smaller brain, then you can't possibly be as smart. I mean, that's the kind of basis that he put it in. And, they're less intelligent and they always will be. And this is the man who we set up as the paradigm of the great theory of revolution, but he was a terrible racist and a terrible misogynist. So she uncovers Charles Darwin. She talks about sex differences in the brain. The fact is that the female brain and the male brain actually are somehow different. The way that they're wired, all sorts of things. But the thing is that, she questions the techniques on which they measure things like magnetic resonance imaging, for example, to say, well, this is where the female brain is active in this part of the brain and the male brain is active in this part of the brain. Therefore, this is definitely shows that there are differences in the female brain and the male brain. But as Saini points out, that you can do magnetic resonance images and find activity also in the brain of a dead salmon. So, is this scientific basis even worthwhile? So that's the Inferior book. In the Superior book, she talks about how the idea of race is so deeply ingrained that you can't even talk about race without accepting the tenets that race even exists. Does that make sense? So we think about race so deeply within ourselves as human beings that even if you want to question the concept of race, you're accepting that race exists because you're questioning it in the first place. And, the thing is that it's just so easy to go and define race by facial features or skin color, or then, so you go, okay, well, this person has this facial feature and this skin and this facial features and this skin color. So therefore, I will make a whole bunch of assumptions about their language, their cuisine, their religion, their moral values. And, because it's easy. It's very easy to do that because it fits with the way we navigate our complicated world. We just go, oh, that's kind of good enough rule of thumb. So if we do it so quickly and easily, and if it's so ingrained, is it really so biologically meaningless? Sayini kind of says. And because she's talking a little bit about the science behind things, she goes into genetics. So just like with the inferior book, she looks at the idea of brain differences and brain scans and how science kind of delves into the difference between male and female. She looks at genetics as the basic science by which people delve into the difference between white people and brown, black, yellow, all the other sorts of colors of people that, and can I just premise here, this is not me speaking. This is not Flavia Marcello's opinion about gender and race. This is me explaining what these books are saying about gender and race. I'm keeping my opinion out of the story. I'm just here to present the thought behind it. So she said that genetics is actually really important because it played a central role in debunking race as a biological entity by showing there's no clear-cut genetic subgroups that map onto conventional notions of race. So Sayini herself points out that she probably has more genetic similarity to her white neighbour than with her woman downstairs who, like her parents, was also born in India. But, obviously it is complicated because there are some identifiable genetic commonalities between population. I mean, people go on ancestry.com and go, oh, yes, I've got ancestors in Holland and Tunisia, or the Netherlands and Tunisia. What does that kind of mean? The point is, though, is that these commonalities occur at different scales and they actually depend on what you're looking for. So if you're looking for, I want to know what countries I'm descending from, you'll find it kind of thing, yeah? The problem is that genetics has also given racists a new place to claim validation of what they want, and that is proof of their superiority. So anyway, she concludes in the end that science, far from killing off biological race and racism, has a great deal to do if it wants to avoid remaining an enabler for racist thought and racist theory. I'll just end with Rafia Zakaria. This is before we get on to the art. So in this class, I'm basically doing all the philosophy, front-ending it in the first 40 minutes or so, and then using the rest of the class to actually talk about how this plays out in art. So finally, I talk about this book here by Rafia Zakaria. So this is a really very recent feminist work from the 2020s. Like Said, Rafia Zakaria is also Palestinian. I think I've omitted to mention that Edward Said is Palestinian. Rafia Zakaria is also a Palestinian writer. She talks about the idea of white feminism and that dominant feminism is based on the beliefs and principles that uphold an exclusive system of whiteness and bolsters white supremacy. So that's her contention. So she says that white feminism actually kills the project of equality because dominant feminism is based on beliefs and principles that uphold exclusive systems of whiteness and that they ultimately ignore the challenges and concerns of women of color. She's a lawyer and she thought, I need to actually start writing an alternative history of feminism that spotlights off-whiteness as opposed to whiteness and looks at the intersectional perspectives of brown, black and Asian women. So she's not like having a go at the feminist movement, but a little bit like what Christopher was doing. She wants to show that there's a range of different experiences and that, every woman that calls herself a feminist, despite any race, class, nationality, or religion, has to see kind of some path forward. So, she just sort of like that. She's basically saying that the feminist movement, reminding us that it does have all of these multiple aspects to it, and that despite the work of Bell Hooks and Christopher, there's been a kind of snapback to white feminism as being dominant because ultimately it's the white women who have been able to be successful and be up there with the men, and that women of colour are still kind of lagging behind. So are there any questions about the sort of philosophical front end of the class before we move on to the art?
I think it's fairly straightforward.
Right.
Really, it's
Okay.
obviously the viewpoints of these various people as for pushing their particular points of views and things like that. So I think it makes sense for them to do it the way they've done it. Really, it's
Mm.
quite easy to understand.
Okay, good. I mean, I tried to sort of weave together a logic of how I represented the different points of view so that you could see the parallels between the concept of otherness through race in inverted commas and then the concept of otherness through gender in inverted commas. Yeah, without getting too bogged down in the trans debate.
Well, that's a sort of a side issue, really. I think, I mean, the
Yes.
main thing is the thrust between the male and female side of things, and then obviously you can
Yeah.
splinter it off into different arguments. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I, consciously don't want to get into it because it's just too distracting. So I just got to make sure air
Well, that's
conditioning was
not
on
what we're
properly.
about, is it,
No,
really? We're just talking about art and
exactly.
philosophy. Yeah.
That's correct. That's correct. Thank you for supporting me in that. All right. Well, let's have a look then at a very short history of the nude, because the nude in art as a theme is, I think, the perfect way in which to illustrate all of this stuff around gender and race. So, here are some nudes that we know and love. Actually, all come out of the Great Roman Collections class, and the idea of wanting to have naked female bodies around the house to gaze on and admire is something that goes all the way back to the 4th century before the Common Era, with the Capitoline Venus. And that the idea that if you wanted to show a woman in nudity, that the best way to do it was to represent Venus, the goddess of love. Because if you look at Greek and Roman statuary, you'll notice that the men are always naked and the women are always clothed. And the only woman who is never clothed is Venus, because as the goddess of love, it's part of her job description, I like to say. And she's often shown naked because she's about to go bathing. So you can see in the Capitoline Venus here that she's got an amphora next to her and her robe has been draped over her amphora and she's about to bathe. And the reason that Venus goes bathing a lot is because each time she bathes, she restores her virginity. And so then this idea of her bathing then gets the excuse, it's the excuse to show a naked female body is by showing Venus bathing. And you can see then that that carries over from the ancient world into the Renaissance, where Raphael paints a portrait of his lover, La Fornarina, but he is able to paint her that because he says, well, it's not really my girlfriend. She's actually Venus. Or Cranach the Elder, even in the not even the Italian art or the Mediterranean art tradition, but even up in Northern Europe, again, you can show Venus with a honeycomb. But here, for example, she's shown with a honeycomb, but the painting has a moral dimension to it because you can see that little Cupid here is holding a honeycomb and poking his finger into the honeycomb and being stung by a bee. And so there is a moral side to showing this painting that if you are tempted by the sweetness of forbidden love, which is the honey, then you will be stung later afterwards and sort of be punished for giving into temptation, because then you get stung by a bee later. So another way to show the naked, an excuse to kind of show the naked female form, was to give a moral aspect to the painting. Same here with the Venus of Urbino. I'm just painting a Venus here. This is a very famous painting by Titian, which we'll see will become very influential in late 19th century representations of the nude. And then again, another excuse to show a naked female woman is that, yes, again, this is a portrait. So like Raphael has the portrait of his lover in La Fornarina, the Count Borghese represents Pauline Bonaparte as Venus in a statue form. So, this is quite scandalous at the time, this portrait of Paulina Borghese as Venus, mainly because she is said to have admitted that she posed nude for this portrait. The other thing is,
What?
a
It
lot of
smells nice.
these.
Sorry?
Have
you been cooked? No, I haven't actually. Well, there's something in the oven. Yes, no.
Sorry,
This is
what was that you're saying, Pamela?
Oh, sorry, Nat. I'll leave you to it.
No, don't worry. I'm not enjoying this one. No. Oh, sorry.
You've got your microphone on, Pamela. You're not
Sorry,
enjoying this class.
sorry.
I'm sorry about that.
I do apologize for that. I joined you
Put your
late.
microphone.
I've
Oh,
lost
okay.
track.
All right. I just said you have a question about the Paulina Borghese because I heard you talking in the background.
No.
No. Okay. All right. All right. So I can't remember what I was saying. Yes, it's the portrait. This is a portrait apparently of Paulina Borghese herself, whereas these portraits here are not actually portraits drawn from actual nudes. They are idealizations or constructions of the nude body. But a lot of these artists would not have had nude models from which to paint. But the scandal here with the Canova was that not only was it painted from an actual model, but this is the wife of a nobleman who is being painted nude. So now let's have a look at one of the themes of the nude in art, which is the painting of Susanna and the elders. So this is a story from the Old Testament about a woman called Susanna, like Venus, is bathing. So she's taking her clothes off to bathe. But the thing is that she is being spied upon by some elders as she is bathing, and they come to her with sexual advances, which she pushes back the sexual advances, but then they blackmail her to say that if you if you reject our advances, we'll just accuse you of adultery anyway, and you'll be you'll get the death penalty. But then she's rescued and ultimately proven innocent, and she becomes a symbol of truth and innocence. So this one shows a painting of Susanna, but she's not nude here. It shows her in this particular painting about to get into the bath. Whereas this one here, another one from 1517 by Lorenzo Lotto, shows the story with her pushing away these elders who are saying, well, you either accept our sexual advances or we accuse you of adultery. She's pushing them away, and the man is coming in to rescue her and to protest her innocence. So, she's this pure, beautiful woman sitting naked in her husband's gardens, and the elders come in and blackmail her. But then this young hero called Daniel comes along and says, she's innocent. And it's a very kind of popular subject because it does two things, a little bit like the painting of Venus and Cupid with the honey. It's about showing a female character as a paradigm of innocence and chastity, but at the same time giving the people who are looking at the painting the excuse to look at a naked woman. Here's another version by Guercino, which you can see is a much more eroticized version of Susanna, whereas here in this one you can see that she's basically covering her body, and she's got the moral dimension is much stronger in this painting here, Whereas this painting by Guercino, yes, they're showing the elders as gazing on her and, you know, lasciviously looking at her, but she is put in a much more kind of eroticized pose. So yes, the painting is here about giving the moral message, but the way that Susanna herself is painted in a way that the idea is to gaze upon her in an erotic way. So now moving on. Oh no, hang on. I've got some more. No, sorry. All right. So that's Susanna and the Elders. Now getting on to the subject of painting a portrait of someone that's actually a painted portrait of someone. So this is one of the more famous nudes in the history of Western art. It's called the nude Maya, or the Maya desnuda. And this is being painted at a time that in Spain, when the Spanish Inquisition was still operating, where a lot of princes had their own kind of collection of nude female paintings, which they used to keep in a secret cabinet. But the church and the Inquisition said that, you know, you were not allowed to have any images of naked women, even if they had some kind of mythological or moral side to them. There was no way you could do it. And in fact, in the 18th century, very, very many examples of nudes that were in the royal collections were actually burnt for being immoral. But somehow this painting was saved, and that it was actually a painting of a real woman. So they think that it might actually be a portrait of the Duchess of Alba, given that Goya had some kind of intimate relationship with her. And in 1815, the Spanish Inquisition actually put Goya on trial to say, this is your painting, you need to admit that you painted it. But we're not really sure what Goya said, but we know that a cardinal was able to intercede on Goya's behalf and save the painting as an artwork. And this happened in 1815. And then the Maya desnuda was actually hidden away in a basement somewhere and not actually rediscovered until the 20th century. So we've got this woman here who, differently to the other naked women, is actually looking at us straight away, looking straight at us in the eye. It's one of the first times pubic hair is actually represented on a female nude in Western art. And apparently the painting itself was actually hung behind this painting here. So this painting here, which is the Maya Vestida, was on a panel, mounted on a timber panel with hinges, and depending on who the guests were, they could actually open the panel and then show the naked one underneath. So you could dress and undress the Maya by moving a timber panel back and forth. So this painting here is, you know, it's 1800. So it's before Canova's portrait of Paolina Borghese. And, you know, it's said that it's the first time that we can see a naked woman who we could actually represented from real life and identifiable as a living woman, as opposed to an idealized version. And there they are, the two together. Ingres, the French artist, is also starting to represent the idea of the nude. But here you can see that this is a nude woman, but she is an odalisque, she's an Oriental woman. So, and here now we see, coming into the history, here is another way in which you can represent a woman who's naked. You can represent her if she's Venus. You can represent her if she's Susanna, because she's out of the Bible and Venus is a mythological one. And we've got a moral dimension to how we show these paintings. But another kind of woman that we're labeled to represent nude with impunity is an Oriental woman, because she is an other. So this is where the idea of female as other and Oriental as other come together in Ingres' paintings of the Odalisque. Also in his other famous painting of the Turkish bath, where we've got these women here who are kind of, you know, laying around in this kind of languid, sexualized poses in a Turkish bath context. But there's one woman in this painting who is different to all the other women. If you notice the women in this, kind of just to the right of the center, there's a woman with her arms crossed over her body. Can you see that?
Yeah.
She is a white woman. So what Ingres has done in this painting here is that he's inserted a white Western woman amongst the Oriental other kind of women and shown her in a more kind of modest pose. She was actually Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of the ambassador. And so what's going on here is that, you know, this is a female bath, a Turkish bath, where no man is allowed to enter. So no man would ever really see these women lying around in these kind of languid, semi-sexualized poses, because this is a women's space that men are not allowed to enter. So how does the male gaze enter this female space? It does it by placing a white Western woman in the middle of it. And so this idea of she looks at the women herself, and through her, the male white gaze can enter this other Oriental space through the presence of the white woman, who is sitting there looking like she's not particularly enjoying herself, with her arms crossed and attempting to cover her nudity, and in a very different attitude to the women that are around her. So that's kind of the nude coming up until, you know, the 1860s in the sort of academic tradition of painting. Then you have the idea of how the nude gets reworked and how artists themselves start making social commentary about the nude, because there's no kind of social commentary about the nude here. It's either kind of moralizing or othering the nude. And that comes along with Manet's Olympia. So Manet causes great scandal at the Salon in 1863. And I just want you to notice there's not very many years between this painting. This is painted in 1862, right? 1863, 1 year later, Manet is basically throwing the whole concept of the nude up in the air and seeing where it lands. So he reworks the traditional theme, and it wasn't just the subject matter that he depicted, but the way that he painted it that caused massive scandal at the 1865 Salon in Paris. So he was quoting, I don't know what happened here. He was quoting the Venus, just flick back to that. He's quoting this painting here, saying, you know, have a look at the similarities between the woman's, the way that she's lying, the way that she's looking at us, the servant in the background and the dog, okay? And then we go to Manet's Olympia. We've got a cat instead of a dog. We've got a slave figure presenting flowers, and she's looking at us in a similar position. But her gaze is a very different kind of gaze. It's kind of challenging us. And we're basically, Venus is basically now, she's a sex worker or a prostitute, and she challenges the viewer by looking straight at her. She has this rather calculating look. And look at the way that her hand is placed over her pubic region, where she's saying, I'm determining access to this area. This is the price that you pay for having access to this area. And so the critics were very upset with this odalisque that was being painted, because she's represented as an odalisque, so in the same kind of way as Ingres is representing a woman who is other, but she is very recognisably a courtesan of Paris. And so Zola said, okay, it seems to me that the main defect of this painting is not the way that she's painted, is that she looks a little bit too much like a young woman a lot of you know. So a lot of the art critics who are going to the salon to criticise the painting are upset, because they're like going, okay, I've been to her, I know her work. And that's what their objection was about. And I think I just put this, I put this in here because Manet was not the only person who represent women as who were prostitutes or sex workers and putting them in their paintings. Caravaggio also caused a lot of scandal by using a courtesan as a model for his Madonna of Loreto. And of course, there have been representations of prostitutes in art. And in the case of Caravaggio, using an actual prostitute as the model in also this painting of the Mary Magdalene. Just going back to Susanna and her elders then, just quickly, it's interesting how then Artemisia Gentileschi represents the elders, where she is very obviously pushing them back while they're trying to importune her with her advances. And the way that she painted Susanna and the elders has a lot to do with her own experience of sexual assault. And she, in a sense, feeling Susanna's pain and painting Susanna and her mannerisms and her reactions to the elders based on her own lived experience of sexual assault. And this, interestingly, Kathleen Gillier, she reworks this whole idea of Susanna and the elders, where she pretended to do a painting that was an X-ray of the original Artemisia Gentileschi painting, and painted it as an X-ray, where she said that actually, if Artemisia Gentileschi would have painted it the way she wanted to, she would have painted her with a knife in her hand, attacking the elders again. So I don't know if you're aware that you can actually take X-rays of paintings and see what the painter had painted before they changed their mind, right? And so what Kathleen Gillier does by reworking the nude is that she says, okay, well, I reckon Artemisia Gentileschi would have actually painted Susanna really, really aggressively fighting back against the elders. So this is not an actual X-ray of Artemisia Gentileschi's painting. It's the artist in the late 90s imagining what may have been under the layers of the painting.
That's quite good. Yeah.
Yes. But going back to Manet's Olympia and reworking the nude, actually, sorry about that. I actually think those slides are out of order. They were supposed to be at the end of Susanna and the elders, so apologies for that. But let's then look at, so Manet reworks the nude by challenging us by being a portrait of a contemporary Parisian courtesan, but then other artists come along and rework the Olympia and rework the nude. So for example, this painting, it's not really a painting, it's kind of like a 3D soft sculpture reconstruction of Manet's Olympia, and it's called I Like Olympia in Blackface. And again, this is where the idea of other connected to race and other connected to gender come together in art. So what you can see that Larry River does. He makes Olympia black and the servant white, and the black cat is a white cat, and puts them in front. And then he does a reconstruction of the Olympia with the white and black relationship, the way Manet does it, and puts it in behind it. And so what he's done here is actually reversing the roles and denouncing the scandal of the segregation of black people in the United States. So this is 1970s. So it's obviously post civil rights movement era, but he's still making a comment on the social divide between black and white people in the US, and really wanting to point out the violence of the social condition of African Americans by swapping over the roles of the black and white Olympia. The Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura does a similar thing with his portrait of himself. So this is a self-portrait of the artist as Olympia. So what you can see that he's basically kind of photoshopped his body into the Manet's Olympia and put a wig on himself and the makeup. He's made the cat into a Japanese cat. Can you see it's got its fist up in the air? Yep. So that's like a Japanese cat. But Morimura has also put his face into the face of the black slave in the background. So you can see that it's Morimura in being both the Olympia and the slave. And that's where he's kind of challenging the gendered racial hierarchies and confronting the Western gaze. So you can see that he's making both a gender and an Orientalist comment here, because this is the way that the white people represent Oriental men, and Oriental men are often thought of as being quite feminine by the white Western dominant culture because they have less body hair, and so that Asian men tend to also be feminized in order to show that they are inferior to Western men. And that's the comment that he's making there, by putting his face both in the by putting his face into the white figure. That's what he's saying. By putting his face into the black made figure, he's actually making a comment about Japan's own colonial history, that is Japan as a colonizing power and Japan's aspiration to colonizing a lot of Asia. They invaded Hong Kong, they invaded China. They were also present, I believe, in Indonesia. And so he's then making a comment about the Japan's colonial past as well by putting his face in the face of the black slave. So he didn't just, so the colonial history, and then he also wanted to critique using the cat, the black cat there, he also wanted to critique Japanese cultural identity, or the ambivalence of Japanese cultural identity in the post-atomic age, that is after basically Nagasaki and Hiroshima were razed to the ground by American bombs, by using the cat as a Japanese cat. So Morimura, if you want to have a look at his work, he's quite interesting. He also does Frida Kahlo, Marilyn Monroe, Leonardo da Vinci. And so I think he's put himself in the face of the Mona Lisa as well, because his whole theme in his artwork is to question male gaze, gender roles, and queerness, because I believe he's also a queer artist. In fact, he does the Olympia again in 2018. And calls it a modern Olympia. And here you can see that he's representing himself as a geisha. Yeah. So the geisha, which is the Japanese equivalent of a courtesan. So he's putting very identifiable Japanese geisha hairdo, but then he's made the made a white man who's actually looking at her and gazing at her. But of course, that's his face that has been westernized So that's his face again, but he's manipulated it in Photoshop or whatever he has done to make it look like that's him, but he's there as a white man. And he wants to kind of invert the idea of the exoticized gaze, and saying that these colonial power dynamics between East and West are still present in 2018. So that is from 1988 to 2018. What's that? That's 30-year difference. Is like going, I made all these comments in 1988, but things still haven't changed. I'm going to redo it again to emphasize the idea. And then a final iteration of Manet's Olympia, which is kind of a little bit more humorous version, is this nude painting of the South Korean president, Park Geun-hye, because of the political scandal that had gripped the country at the time. And so basically you've got Park, who is the Korean Prime Minister, and then the woman as the servant girl is actually her close friend Choi Soon-sil, because they were apparently colluding in corruption. And so basically Ms. Choi used her relationship with the president to extract donations from corporations and feed them into the foundations she'd run. And then it also shows Miss Park asleep. And while in the background, the Seoul ferry, which sank and killing 304 people, is happening outside the window because she was very much criticised of the way that she handled the ferry disaster that happened in 2014. So here's a kind of more, I guess, grassroots guerrilla use of art to make a political statement in Korea. So that's the legacy of Manet's Olympia and all of its manifestations of working and reworking the idea of the nude to make various social and political commentary. Another interesting way of reworking and commenting on the idea of the nude is this performance piece by Yoko Ono. It's called Cut Piece. And Yoko Ono is a very, very important and influential conceptual artist who incredibly avant-garde. Unfortunately, in Western culture, she gets cast as the woman who broke up the Beatles. And that's basically all that she is in a lot of Western culture. But she is actually a very, very important and influential conceptual artist. A lot of her artworks were actually instructions where you can say, well, do this and you have created a form of art. But a lot of her pieces were also performance pieces, including Cut Piece. And in Cut Piece, what happens is that a solitary performer, in this case, Yoko Ono, performing her own artwork, sits on a stage with a pair of scissors. And the audience can come up and just cut away a piece of her clothing. And the piece ends when the performer decides that the piece has ended. So the performer can sit there and have their clothes cut away by the audience. Anyone can come up on the stage and cut it off. And then when she has decided that she is nude enough, she says the performance piece is over. So what is happening is that she's kind of demonstrating that people can confront their inner demons like fear, distrust, and violence and vanquish them from daily life through force of will. So by saying that I'm here and you can cut my clothes off, but I decide when you've cut off enough clothes, gives the idea of agency over sexuality and nudeness. She goes, I'll decide how much of my body you see. But I'll also do it with this very kind of dangerous, almost threatening thing of idea of using a pair of scissors so close to her flesh. But the other thing that I think is important here that Yoko Ono emphasizes is that it doesn't have to be a woman doing this cut piece. A man can also perform this piece as well. So Yoko Ono herself said that, you know, when she was doing it in the 1960s, and you see she did it various times. She did it in 1964, in 1965, in 1966, and she redid it again in 2003. She said, in the 1960s, I did it out of anger, as if taking all the violence of the world upon me. But when she did it again in 2003, she said, following the political changes through the year, particularly after 9/11, she felt terribly vulnerable, like the most delicate wing could bring me tears. Cut peace is my hope for world peace. So it's interesting that the social and political context in which the cut piece is performed for Yoko Ono herself changes the power of the artwork and what the artwork could say for the artist herself. And the other thing I think it's important to emphasize, I'll say it again, about the cut piece and its way of reworking the nude is that the instructions are for artists of any gender or gender and or race to take on. And the thing is that the cut piece will have a different power depending on who it is that is having the clothing cut away from them and the social political context in which they perform the cut piece. And I think that that's part of the power of this work. So we've been talking a lot about the gaze, and Barbara Kruger was an artist in the 80s who directly engages with the idea of the gaze with her very famous piece, which is untitled, but it is subtitle is "Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face." So she kind of was a layout editor at women's magazines before she became an artist. And then in 1981, the concept of the male gaze actually became quite central to feminist theory. And, you know, the question was, could women truly be liberated from objectification implied by the act of being looked at? You know, because basically, if you look at John Burge's 1972 book, Ways of Seeing, it describes a history of Western oil painting as a catalogue of submissive nude women arranged for the pleasure of male viewers. And so Kruger wants to start to confront this tradition by using the phrase, and then the image of the woman being looked at is very obviously a kind of classical female figure, the idea of the classical art. So, you know, Lacan was actually the philosopher who came up with the idea of the gaze, which then was being called into question by feminist theory, that he says that, you know, the gaze is what we use to give structure and stability to our illusions and fantasies of ourself. And it's only through art and language, that is the modes of representation, whether it be visual representation or written representation, that the subject can make his or her desire for the lost object known. So he's like going, well, we need to gaze at things in order to make our desire known. But obviously, it's very much the male desire which kind of rules things. So, you know, she continued with various other pieces like Your Body is a Battleground. And this other piece here, We Will Not Become What We Mean to You. So the idea is that, you know, women are not necessarily going to construct themselves for the male gaze. And you can see how Barbara Kruger's work then is an artistic representation of some of the ideas that Christopher and de Beauvoir were saying. And so you can see what she says herself, a quote from her: "I'm interested in how identities are constructed, how stereotypes are formed, how narratives sort of congeal and become history." And I'm going to end with the work of the Guerrilla Girls. So the Guerrilla Girls were a collective of female artists who all worked under pseudonyms. And they were kind of like, they had different members of different times. And what they did is they basically were speaking out against inequality in the art world. And they always used pseudonyms of actual female artists. So Kathi Kollwitz is a German artist from the Expressionist period. And they wanted to kind of act on the protests that were already happening. So there were a lot of protests going on about discrimination of women and people of colour, but nobody was kind of listening. And they were saying, well, how can we, as artists who find it hard to even get a gallery show as women artists, how can we make our ideas known? They decided to take to the street. They decided to go and use the street, which is where people look or not look. And they decided to make a series of political posters that denounced inequality in the art world, but through denouncing inequality in the art world, denouncing inequality through society overall. And their most famous work is this poster called "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum?" So they basically went through and said, okay, they're less than 5% of artists are women, but 85% of nudes are male. So they were basically got their statistics from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and made this poster. And because they were all also trained graphic designers, they actually used their graphic design skills. So you will recognize that the naked body in this painting is Ingres Odalisque, but they put a gorilla mask on her. So the idea of being gorillas is that they were saying, well, we're kind of a, they came up with the name Guerrilla Girls because they had a kind of collective brainstorming session. They wanted to appropriate an aura of strength and aggression and announce that they were a different kind of group, but they also wanted to reclaim the term girl, because girl often gets used in a derogatory way, and they wanted to give power to the idea of girlness. And so they said that they're a women's artist terrorist organisation. And they said that we want to become conscious of the art world. Men were not officially allowed to join the group, but some men actually did help out, and they were called the Baboon Boys. And when the Guerrilla Girls went out pasting their posters up in the streets, they had some Baboon Boys providing assistance during their action events. So you could call this a form of terrorism, artist terrorism, but they basically, what they were doing without knowing, were a form of what's called culture jamming. So culture jamming is a term that came along afterwards, and it references, and I quote, a range of tactics used to critique, subvert, and otherwise jam the workings of consumer culture, including media pranks, advertising parodies, textual poaching, billboard appropriation, street performance, and reclamation of urban spaces for non-commercial use. So these are the Guerrilla Girls in action. They basically went around dressed in black, wearing gorilla masks at night, and putting posters up everywhere to comment about social inequality. So this is the spring of 1985. They tend to use black and white. This got colour here, but a lot of their posters were in black and white because the black and white is much cheaper to print. And they basically used wheat paste, like flour and water paste, to put protest shows up all over New York City. And here are some of the examples of their work. They used to even write fake letters. They actually wrote letters to collectors and to gallery owners, with this kind of very, almost sarcastic tone. Dearest art collector, it has come to our attention that your collection, like most, does not contain enough art by women. We know that you feel terrible about this and will rectify the situation immediately. All our love, Guerrilla Girls. And here are some of their, this is another one of their actions. They made sure they went to the Venice Biennale and made a comment about women artists by appropriating an image from a Fellini film, which famously has Marcello Mastroianni riding a woman as if she's some kind of beast of burden, but notice that underneath her hands and underneath his feet are all paintings of nudes. You can even recognize that Artemisia Gentileschi under the letter U. You can see Artemisia Gentileschi, Susanna and the elders in there. And again, it isn't La Dolce Vita for female artists in Venice. And again, a sort of set of statistics. So this was one particular campaign of theirs aimed towards the Venice Art Biennale from 2005. These are some of your the black and white ones that they wrote. Again, you can see a lot of it is about being ironic, being kind of humorous about the whole thing. Well, it's really great to be a woman artist. You can choose between career and motherhood. You can, you know, have 4 part-time jobs so that you can survive. You can get your picture in an art magazine by wearing a gorilla suit. And you don't have to be so embarrassed that anyone might call you a genius. They had a very particular attack at the Whitney Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of Modern Art. You can see that here she is reviewing the Whitney with a banana on their stool. And in fact, what happened is that they came out with a very specific critique of the Whitney Biennale in 1987 and saying, you know, in 1993, 40% women and 35% artists of colour. They attacked the new downtown Guggenheim in 1992, whose opening show featured 4 white male artists. And in fact, after they attacked the Guggenheim for not having any female artists, they ran around and got Louise Bourgeois in. And so they said, oh, quick, we better put a woman artist in because the Guerrilla Girls are, you know, attacking us. Because they say, oh, your opening shows are 4 white boys at the White Boys Museum. So they got Louise Bourgeois, and then Louise Bourgeois, she knew that she was just being called in at the last minute as a token woman. So she came to the opening wearing a paper bag over her head with a gorilla mask drawn on it, which I thought was a great comment. The Guerrilla Girls also made comments about the whiteness of art with their We Sell White Bread poster, which, you know, was also crossing over into the fact that, yes, there are not a lot of women artists, but there are also not a lot of artists of colour as well. And I will end today's class about art and the other with their a very final piece by the Guerrilla Girls about what the world needs, and that is an estrogen bomb. And if we drop that on white supremacists, anti-feminists, homophobes, transphobes, ultra-naturalists, etc., we can actually make a better world. So thanks for coming to this class. I will now stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very good, Flavia. Thank you. It's been very interesting and very stimulating. All that stuff towards the end always does my head in, really. I just think like people that get on and do painting together and stuff like that. That's what I think. But
that's right. Well, that's why I ended with the estrogen bomb. Wanted to end on a positive note.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but thank you for all the work you put into the course. Very interesting.
Thank you all. I'm so sorry about the last class being disrupted. And I hope to see you again in some of my other classes. It was a pleasure to have you all.
I think I'd like to do the Renaissance course with you anyway.
Good. Well, I look forward to seeing you there. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye then.
Thank you.
Yes,
bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.